Welcome back to the Edmonds School District Automotive Training Center. This is Hot Rod High School. In today's episode, we are going to be using a compression tester to perform a compression test on this inline four-cylinder engine. So, coveralls on, safety glasses on. Let's go to work. So, to start off this test, we're going to remove all of the spark plugs from the engine. Spark plugs come out of these holes here in the top of the cylinder head. And you can see that we have one in each of the four cylinders. They have already been removed. The reason for that is because we want the engine to be able to crank over as smoothly as possible and not have to go up against the compression events from any of the cylinders that we are not testing. So getting familiar with our tool, we have the compression test gauge, and we have our compression test hose with the adapter. So this adapter is already the correct size to thread down into those spark plug holes to be able to do this test. A couple of things while we're testing. Now, obviously, I have an engine on a stand here. But you could do this test just as easily on an engine that is inside the vehicle. Couple of things to keep in mind. If you are working on an engine that is installed in the vehicle, you need to disable the fuel system and the spark system before you perform this test. You don't want the engine to be attempting to start when there's no spark plugs in there. You can cause damage to the coils. And obviously, you don't want the fuel system running when the engine is not going to be running. Okay. In order to do this test, we're going to start by threading our adapter down into the cylinder. So we have here the spark plug hole, and now I can just take my adapter, run it down into that hole, and then I'm just going to tighten it up until it's all the way threaded in, until I can't tighten it anymore, and just by hand. And now we are ready to connect our gauge and do the test. Okay, so now we're going to connect our gauge. We're going to do that by pulling back on this little section right here, coupling the two together and letting go. Now the gauge is attached to the adapter. Now we're going to do this by, we're going to crank the engine over and watch the gauge as it moves. And we're going to do 4 revolutions of the engine, or 4 cycles of the engine. We want to watch 4 compression events happen. If you can't hear, if you can't have the engine turn over by hearing, then you can always just watch the gauge. And each time the needle bumps up, that's another compression event. Now, you could do 4 revolutions, you could do 10 revolutions. It doesn't really matter. What matters most is making sure that you do the same number of revolutions in each cylinder. Another thing to keep in mind is if I'm doing a compression test on one of the cylinders, I need to do a compression test on all of the cylinders. So, for example, say I have a misfire code saying I have a misfire in cylinder number 2. Well, I wouldn't just do a compression test in cylinder number 2. I'd want to do a compression test in all the cylinders because the actual compression reading isn't as important as the comparison of the compression readings between all the cylinders. So I'll start here with cylinder number 1. We'll do that compression test, and then we'll move on and do the rest of the cylinders as well. Now, if I was doing this with an engine that was in a car, I'd want to hold the throttle pedal wide open or use something to hold the throttle open while I was doing the test, and then I'd just use the key to crank the engine over. We don't have a key switch on this one. We don't have a throttle pedal on this one, so I'm going to have to hold the throttle open by hand, just like so. And then we have a little push button here that'll activate our starter motor and get the engine to spin over. So let's go ahead and watch that gauge while the engine cranks, and we'll watch that compression go up with each stroke. So now I've got my reading. I'd record my reading down on my paper for cylinder number 1. Quick hint here to all the students watching this right now. Cylinder number 1 is at the front of the engine, and cylinder number 4 is over at the back. So when you're recording down your readings, make sure that you record down which cylinder is number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, now that I have my reading for cylinder number 1, I'm going to push this little button that's on the side of the gauge. That's going to release the compression that's showing on the gauge there. I can then unscrew my adapter from cylinder number 1, move it on to cylinder number 2, thread it in, and now I can repeat this test on cylinder number 2. Once again, holding the throttle open and cranking the engine. Release the compression, and now move on to cylinder number 3. Well, obviously after recording your result. So hold the throttle open and test the next cylinder. And then we record our result and move on to our last cylinder. And once again, hold the throttle open and engage the starter. Okay, so now we've performed our compression test on all the cylinders. We would have recorded down all those results, and then make sure to put all the components of our compression tester away once you've finished.